The emergency lights inside the Mark 85 armor flashed a frantic crimson, painting Tony Stark's face in a grim, pulsing glow. One moment, they had been hurtling through a chaotic interdimensional rift, a desperate maneuver to contain a rogue energy signature that threatened to unravel their own reality. The next, the rift had collapsed, spitting them out into an inky blackness punctuated by distant, malevolent stars. Now, the suit screamed diagnostics. Status Friday. Tony's voice was tight, a thin thread of calm against the roaring chaos of his internal alarms. Critically low power, boss. Main thrusters offline. Repulsor output at 5%, and we are not in Kansas anymore. Friday's synthetic voice was unusually strained, lacking her usual dry wit. The external viewports showed a vast, impossibly ancient battlefield. Before them, a titanic, ruinous structure, part fortress, part cathedral, all gargantuan, drifted in the void, riddled with craters and spewing debris like a dying leviathan. "No kidding," Tony muttered, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage-strewn void. Any sign of the kid? A small, agile figure, battered but miraculously intact, drifted into view, tethered to a piece of debris by a rapidly deploying webline. Spider-Man, Peter Parker. He looked like he'd been dragged through a black hole backwards, which in a way, he had. "Mr. Stark, you all right?" Peter's voice crackled over the comms, a tremor of youthful fear barely masked by his inherent optimism. His red and blue suit was scorched, a spider lens cracked. "Where are we? My spider sense is doing whatever the exact opposite of chill is. I'm alive, kid." "And your spider sense is probably right on the money," Tony replied, his mind racing. The power cells were failing and fast. They were adrift in a hostile, alien void. This wasn't just another dimension. It felt different, older, darker. He spotted a massive derelict spacecraft, a skeletal hulk of metal and ceramite, drifting slowly towards the ruined fortress. It was their only hope for shelter, or a way out. "All right, Pete, new plan," Tony commanded, his voice firm despite the failing power. "We need to get to that derelict. It's our best bet for cover and maybe a power source. My thrusters are slagged. Can you give me a push?" Peter, without hesitation, swung towards Tony, launching a web line that snagged against the Mark 85's shoulder plate. With a grunt of effort, he began to pull, his enhanced strength straining against the bulk of the armor. Tony fired what little repulsor energy he had left, a pathetic sputter, to help guide them. They moved slowly, inexorably, towards the dark maw of the spacecraft's ruptured hull. As they drew closer, the sheer scale of it became terrifyingly apparent. These weren't ships, they were cities in space, vast brutalist monuments to war and suffering. Inside the derelict, the silence was broken only by the whirring of Tony's failing systems and Peter's ragged breathing. The air was cold, metallic, and carried the faint scent of ash and something else, something ancient and unholy. The interior was a maze of rusted gantries and corroded machinery, too large for human hands, too alien for human minds. The architecture was Gothic, ornate yet brutal, covered in strange script and faded, unsettling iconography. "Any readings, Friday?" Tony whispered, his voice low. "Nothing coherent, boss. Energy signatures are bizarre. High levels of residual psychic energy, trace amounts of exotic matter, and a pervasive background radiation that defies classification. Also, I'm picking up faint life signs, multiple, and they don't register as anything in our databases." Peter's voice crackled, filled with genuine horror. "Mr. Stark, my spider sense, it's screaming. Not just a warning, it feels like 100 warnings all at once, like something is about to jump out of every shadow. Stay focused, Pete. We need to find a secure spot, analyze our situation, and for the love of everything, don't touch anything," Tony ordered, though even he felt a primal unease. His armor's systems were almost completely offline. He was a sitting duck. He spotted a massive reinforced door, half ripped from its hinges, leading into what looked like a central command chamber. It offered the only semblance of security. "There," Tony pointed, using a dim optical flare. Our best bet for now. Peter quickly weblined ahead, scouting the path. The chamber beyond the door was vast, circular, littered with the skeletal remains of control panels and what looked like weapon emplacements. Dust motes danced in the faint light filtering through breaches in the hull. As Tony stepped inside, his boot crunched on something metallic. He looked down. It was a massive, empty casing, easily the size of a small car. "These guys don't mess around," Tony breathed. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows. Peter froze, his spider sense flaring violently. Tony's heart hammered against his ribs. The sound wasn't animal, it was something else, something engineered. He activated his last resort, a small, manually charged arc reactor in his palm, casting a flickering blue light. The light illuminated a hulking, 8-foot-tall figure emerging from the gloom. It was clad in incredibly thick ceramite armor, dark green with bronze trim, scarred and ancient. Its helmet was a skull-like visage, utterly devoid of humanity, with glowing red lenses that fixed on them with predatory intent. In its massive, gauntleted hand, it held a chainsword, a monstrous blade with motorized teeth that looked capable of rending steel. "Intruders!" A synthesized voice boomed from the figure, devoid of emotion, a cold, mechanical pronouncement that vibrated through the chamber. "You are not authorized. Prepare to be purged." Iron Man, his armor drained, his weapons useless, knew this was it. He wasn't in Kansas anymore. And these weren't Kree or Skrulls. This was something far, far worse. The massive armored warrior, a space marine of the Death Guard, took another deliberate step forward, its chainsword whirring with a hungry growl. Tony felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This wasn't a fight he could win, not with his armor near dead. He glanced at Peter, whose spider sense was still screaming, making him twitch with frantic energy. The kid was ready to fight, but Tony knew it would be suicide. "Stand down," Tony commanded, projecting what little authority he had left. His voice was calm, authoritative, a deliberate mask over his rising panic. "We mean no harm. We're lost." The Space Marine halted, its head cocked slightly, as if processing the alien's speech. Its glowing red eyes narrowed. "Lost? There is no lost in the Emperor's domain, only duty, and those who betray it." It raised its chainsword, the weapon's teeth spinning faster, kicking up sparks. "You possess unknown technology. You are a threat to Imperial doctrine. You will be eradicated." Whoa, hold on," Peter interjected, his voice high with desperation. "Imperial doctrine? We just got here. We're friendly, mostly." He darted forward, throwing a web line at the Space Marine's chest plate. It hit with a thwip, then immediately snapped. The adhesive simply couldn't hold. The Space Marine simply stared at the broken web, then at Peter, as if he were an amusing insect. It then brought the chainsword down in a terrifying arc. Tony shoved Peter out of the way, the massive blade missing them by inches, tearing a gouge in the metal floor. The force of the blow shook the entire chamber. "Kid, get out of here," Tony yelled, his voice rough. "Try to find a way to power up my suit. Anything! But Mr. Stark, I can't just leave you," Peter protested, scrambling back. "That's an order, Spider-Man," Tony retorted, hoping the authority in his voice would override Peter's loyalty. He knew he couldn't fight this thing, but he could buy Peter time. His gaze scanned the chamber, desperately searching for anything that could be used as a weapon, a distraction. There was nothing, just more derelict consoles and twisted metal. The Space Marine lumbered forward again, its movements slow but unstoppable. Tony realized its speed was irrelevant. Its armor was impervious to anything he had left. He was out of options. As the warrior closed in, Peter's frantic spider sense made him do something desperate. He launched himself not at the Marine, but towards the far side of the chamber, hoping to draw its attention. Suddenly, the ship shuddered violently. A distant explosion echoed through the hull, and the internal lights flickered. The Space Marine paused, its glowing eyes scanning the damage. Its helmet speakers hissed. "Warning, hull breach detected. Compartment Gamma 7 is compromised." This was their impossible factor, their first escalation. Tony seized the moment. "Friday, Any chance to exploit that breach? Attempting to reroute minimal power to a structural integrity scanner, boss. Stand by, Friday responded, her voice strained. The Space Marine turned its attention back to them, its moment of distraction over. The Emperor protects. You will still die. Another explosion rocked the ship, closer this time, and a section of the ceiling collapsed, raining debris. The Space Marine was momentarily covered in dust and falling metal. Peter, seizing the distraction, web-zipped towards a massive, half-collapsed gantry, pulling himself onto it. He moved like a shadow, trying to draw the Space Marine's attention away from Tony. "Hey, ugly in the battle plate, over here!" Peter shouted, launching a piece of debris at the warrior. It bounced harmlessly off its shoulder. The Space Marine snarled, a sound more mechanical than organic, and lumbered towards Peter, its heavy boots echoing in the unstable chamber. Tony watched, helpless, his heart in his throat. This wasn't a fight. This was a hunt. As Peter scrambled higher onto the gantry, the Space Marine raised its bolt gun, a terrifyingly large, boxy firearm, and opened fire. Explosive rounds slammed into the metalwork around Peter, each one detonating with a concussive blast, tearing fresh holes in the already ruined structure. Peter dodged frantically, his agility his only defense. "Friday now!" Tony yelled, seeing Peter cornered. "Scanning structural weakness identified, boss. Main support beam for this section is critically stressed. If you can target the energy conduit directly above it..." "I can't even power a headlight, Friday." Tony gritted his teeth. He knew what he had to do. He activated his failing boot jets, giving him just enough thrust for a clumsy powered jump. He aimed for a rusted control panel, a desperate, impossible gamble. He slammed his armored fist into it, then into another, trying to overload something, anything. The Space Marine, focused on Peter, ignored Tony. It brought its bolt gun to bear. A kill shot aimed at Peter. Just as the warrior squeezed the trigger, Tony's desperate hammering paid off. With a groan of tortured metal, a cascade of sparks erupted from the ceiling above the Space Marine. A massive power-generating conduit, ruptured by the earlier explosions, sagged precariously. It released a shower of volatile energy, arcing wildly. The Space Marine paused, its ancient armor deflecting most of the energy, but the chaotic surge briefly shorted its target acquisition systems. Its bolt gun stuttered, the shot going wide. "Now, Pete!" Tony screamed. "Bring it down!" Peter didn't hesitate. He launched a barrage of web lines, not at the Marine, but at the sagging conduit and the weakened support beam directly above the warrior. He pulled with all his might, his muscles straining, his teeth gritted. With a deafening shriek of tearing metal, the entire section of the gantry and the conduit collapsed. The Space Marine, caught directly underneath, was engulfed in a shower of sparks, twisted metal, and tons of debris. The chamber shook violently. Silence descended, thick and heavy. Peter landed hard, breathing heavily, his body trembling. Tony, also winded, stumbled towards the collapsed section. Is it gone?" Peter whispered, his voice hushed with disbelief and lingering terror. Tony scanned the wreckage with his failing optics. He couldn't see the Marine, but he felt a chilling certainty. "No, Pete," he said, his voice grim. "Nothing that big goes down that easy." He knew instinctively that this was just a temporary reprieve, a single, isolated victory against an impossible foe. The true nightmare had only just begun. The silence in the ruined chamber was heavy, punctuated only by the creak of settling metal and the whine of Tony's failing systems. Peter, still wide-eyed, stared at the mountain of debris that had buried the towering warrior. His spider sense, though no longer screaming, throbbed with a persistent, low-grade thrum of danger. "We need to move, and we need to move now," Tony stated, his voice flat with urgency. "That thing is not dead, and if there are more of them..." He didn't finish the thought. The implications were too grim. "Friday, anything, any power source, even residual. I need to get this suit online. Scanning, boss. Low-level power fluctuations detected in a maintenance access tunnel, Sector Beta 9. It's weak, inconsistent, but it's something. Enough to maybe bring your core systems back to minimal functionality. Lead the way." Tony ordered, turning to Peter. Kid, stick close. No heroics, just survival. Peter nodded, his usual quips replaced by a somber resolve. Understood, Mr. Stark. Just no more giant armored guys with chainsaws, okay? They moved through the derelict vessel, a maze of oppressive architecture and metallic shadows. The air grew colder, the oppressive silence more profound. Every creak of the hull, every distant clang made Peter flinch, his spider sense a constant low thrum against his nerves. Tony kept his arc reactor light barely alive, a meager beacon in the pervasive gloom. They found the access tunnel. It was narrow, cramped, choked with conduits and pipes, a stark contrast to the grand, brutalist chambers they had traversed. The power fluctuations Friday had detected were indeed there, faint pulses of raw, unrefined energy flowing through ancient cables. All right, Friday, how do we tap into this junk? Tony asked, scanning the conduits with his suit's failing internal sensors. Warning, the energy is highly unstable, boss. Untempered. It would be like trying to plug a smartphone into a lightning strike. We need a way to filter and regulate it. I don't have time for a science fair project, Friday. Give me a direct tap. I'll manually regulate the input. It'll be rough, but it might get me a repulsor blast or two, Tony stated, already reaching for a multi-tool. Peter, seeing the danger, spoke up. Mr. Stark, maybe I can help. I'm pretty good with wires, and I'm fast. If there's a short, I could probably pull back before you know. Tony hesitated. It was risky, but Peter's agility might be an advantage. All right, Pete, but follow my instructions precisely. This stuff isn't like your web fluid. It'll fry you. Under Tony's precise, rapid-fire instructions, Peter moved with surprising dexterity, his nimble fingers weaving through the ancient, corroded conduits. He identified the main power line, stripped the insulation, and then, using a piece of salvaged metal and his own ingenuity, fashioned a rudimentary shunt. It was dangerous, crude, but it worked. A jolt of raw energy coursed through Tony's armor. Sparks flew, the suit bucked, and Tony gritted his teeth, his internal systems screaming. He felt the raw power, wild and untamed, threatening to overload everything. He fought it, his genius mind working at lightning speed, manually adjusting, diverting, stabilizing. Slowly, painfully, the red warning lights subsided, replaced by a dull amber. His internal diagnostic readouts flickered to life. Power at 10%, boss. Stabilized but precarious. Repulsors still offline, but we have enough juice for limited thruster use and a full sensor sweep. Good enough, Tony breathed, sweat beading on his forehead. He had a fighting chance now. He activated his full sensor suite. The results were immediate and horrifying. Boss, I'm detecting significant enemy movement. Multiple contacts, heavily armored. They're converging on our last known position in the command chamber. And they're not alone. I'm picking up smaller, faster signatures. Swarms. Swarms? What kind of swarms? Peter asked, his voice strained. Unknown, Pete. But they're moving fast and coming our way, Tony replied, his gaze fixed on the tactical display. It seems our friend from before wasn't alone, and he brought company. Lots of it. The distant sounds of heavy footsteps and metallic clatter began to echo down the tunnel. The Space Marine, or another like it, was closing in, and the swarms were with them. The precarious calm was shattered. They were trapped, caught between a rock and an impossible place. The desperate fight for survival had just gotten a whole lot more desperate. The full, massive implication of their situation was becoming terrifyingly clear. The heavy, rhythmic thudding of armored boots grew louder, echoing off the cramped confines of the maintenance tunnel. Tony's newly functional, albeit limited, sensors painted a grim picture. 3 massive Space Marines, accompanied by what Friday identified as hundreds of smaller, chittering forms, were rapidly approaching their position. The raw energy they tapped into had provided a brief reprieve, but it had also, perhaps, alerted their pursuers. All right, kid. New plan. Tactical retreat, Tony stated, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. We're not fighting them head-on in this sardine can. We need to find an exit, and fast. Exit to where, Mr. Stark? And what about the swarms? Peter asked, his eyes darting nervously towards the tunnel entrance. His spider sense was a dull roar now, a constant sickening throb. Anywhere but here. And the swarms will improvise, Tony replied, already moving. He scanned the tunnel's labyrinthine layout on his internal display. Friday, is there an alternative route out of this section? Something not directly in their path? Affirmative, boss. A ventilation shaft, extremely narrow, leads up to a higher deck. It appears structurally compromised, but possibly passable for Spider-Man. For you, boss, it's a tight squeeze, even for Mark 85. Tight squeeze is better than being stomped flat, Tony grunted. Pete, you lead. I'll cover your 6. If we can get up to a higher vantage point, maybe we can assess the layout of this death trap. They scrambled deeper into the dark tunnel, the relentless thudding of the Space Marine's boots and the high-pitched skittering of the swarm drawing ever closer. Peter's agility was their greatest asset here, allowing him to navigate the tight spaces with impressive speed. Tony followed, scraping metal against metal, his armor barely fitting. The air grew stale, dust-choked, and increasingly cold. Suddenly, a section of the tunnel wall exploded inwards just behind them, showering them with shrapnel and dust. A bolt gun round. It wasn't a direct hit, but it was close. Too close. They know where we are, Peter gasped, stumbling. No kidding, genius, Tony retorted. Keep moving! They reached the ventilation shaft Friday had identified. It was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for Tony's armor. Peter, however, slipped into it like an eel, his enhanced grip making short work of the damaged grating. I'm in, Mr. Stark. It's really tight up here, but I think I can make it to that next level. Peter's voice crackled, muffled by the metallic confines of the shaft. Good. I'm right behind you, Tony confirmed, already straining to force his armored form into the opening. He heard the Space Marines entering the tunnel now, their heavy footsteps shaking the entire structure. The swarms were a maddening chorus of skittering claws and faint, insectile clicks. As Tony struggled, the shaft abruptly opened into a large, dimly lit cavernous space, an industrial processing bay, massive and echoing. Peter was already halfway across, scaling a towering pipe. Tony, seeing the vastness of the space, decided to make a stand. He could barely move inside the shaft, but outside, he had limited mobility. He blasted his way out of the ventilation shaft, the weak thrusters sending him spinning into the processing bay. He landed hard, sparking. He needed to buy Peter more time. Just as the first Space Marine emerged from the ventilation shaft, its bolt gun already raising, Tony fired his right boot thruster, sending him skidding towards a massive control console. He smashed his fist into it, hoping to cause a diversion, a collapse, anything. The console sparked and groaned. Emergency lights, a dull, sickly yellow, flickered to life, illuminating the cavernous bay. And what they saw made Peter gasp, even from his perch. Hundreds, possibly thousands of the swarms were now visible. They were arachnid-like, multi-limbed creatures with chitinous carapaces, each roughly the size of a dog. Their many eyes glowed with malevolent green light, and razor-sharp claws clicked against the metal floor. They poured from hidden vents and conduits, a living tide of nightmare converging on Tony. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," Tony muttered, his voice edged with a grim, desperate humor. He was surrounded. 3 Space Marines, moving with implacable resolve, were advancing from the tunnel entrance, and the swarms were closing in, a chittering, scuttling tide. "Pete, get to that next level." "Don't wait for me," Tony commanded, bracing himself. His armor was barely holding together, his weapons all but useless, but he wasn't going down without a fight. One of the Space Marines aimed its bolt gun, another drew a heavy, ornate power axe. The swarms, however, were faster. They leaped, clambering over each other, their green eyes fixed on Tony's armored form. He unleashed a desperate, short burst from his remaining thrusters, spinning to avoid the first wave, but more were coming. Narration. The air crackled with desperate energy as Tony Stark, His armor, a flickering beacon against the encroaching darkness, found himself at the epicenter of a nightmare. He was a lone, broken hero, facing an impossible tide. This was not a battle. It was a last stand. Every instinct screamed for retreat, but retreat was no longer an option. Suddenly, the massive industrial bay shuddered. A deafening roar erupted from somewhere below, a sound so profound it vibrated through Tony's very bones. The ancient machinery in the bay groaned under an immense unseen pressure. "What was that, Friday?" Tony demanded, fighting off several of the chittering creatures, their claws scratching against his diminishing shields. "Warning, boss. Massive energy surge detected directly below us. The entire section is experiencing a critical structural failure. It appears something immense is attempting to breach the hull." The floor beneath Tony's feet cracked, a spiderweb of fissures appearing in the reinforced plating. The swarms paused, their chittering turning into a collective, agitated whine. Even the Space Marines seemed to falter for a moment, their implacable advance momentarily halted by the seismic event. "Mr. Stark," Peter's panicked voice cut through the comms. "The whole deck is about to give. You have to get out of there." Tony looked up. The Space Marines were recovering, raising their weapons. The swarms were converging again, and the floor was literally collapsing beneath him. He was trapped between an impossible foe, a ravenous horde, and a ship tearing itself apart. He activated his failing thrusters, launching himself towards Peter's perch, a desperate last-ditch effort. He had to make it. He had to. Just as he reached the edge of the collapsing section, a massive fissure opened directly in his path. A monstrous, multi-jointed appendage, green and scaled, tipped with a blade-like claw, erupted from the depths, sweeping upwards with terrifying speed. It was immense, easily the size of a cargo freighter, and it was reaching for him. Tony Stark, Iron Man, was about to be dragged into the abyss by a horror beyond comprehension. The monstrous limb, a chitinous green nightmare tipped with a razor-sharp scythe, exploded through the deck plating, sweeping upwards with terrifying speed. Tony, already in midair, twisted his failing thrusters, trying to gain enough altitude to escape its grasp. He felt the wind of its passage, the faint, acrid smell of its alien biology. It moved with a speed that defied its immense size, and its trajectory was aimed directly at him. "Mr. Stark, look out!" Peter's voice was a frantic shriek over the comms. Tony threw every ounce of dwindling power into his thrusters. He barely cleared the limb's arcing swing, the massive scythe claw missing him by a hair's breadth. He slammed into the wall of the industrial bay, sparks showering from his armor. The impact sent a jolt of pain through him, but he was alive. For now, the creature's limb retracted, then burst through the deck again, closer this time, tearing an even larger hole. A grotesque, segmented head, all fangs and multifaceted eyes emerged, followed by a vast armored torso. It was a monster of truly cosmic proportions, far larger than any living thing Tony had ever encountered. It roared, a guttural shriek that vibrated through the entire vessel, shaking loose more debris from the ceiling. The Space Marines, surprisingly, did not immediately open fire on the new threat. Instead, their helmeted visages seemed to focus on it with a grim understanding, a grim recognition. Their bolt guns remained trained on Tony and Peter, but their body language suggested a shift in priorities. "Friday, analysis." Tony gasped, scrambling to his feet, his armor groaning in protest. "Analysis complete, boss. Categorizing as catastrophic threat, biological. Estimated mass, 10,000 tons. Bioweaponry detected. Designation, Hive Tyrant, a Tyranid bioform. Threat level, extinction event." Friday's voice held a chilling lack of emotion, a cold, clinical pronouncement of impending doom. Tyranid. Hive Tyrant? What in the multiverse is a Tyranid? Peter cried, clinging desperately to his perch, staring down at the burgeoning horror. His spider sense wasn't just screaming now, it was a full-blown mental meltdown. "Doesn't matter, kid. It's bad and it's getting worse," Tony yelled, his mind racing. This wasn't just a powerful enemy. It was an existential threat, a force of nature, He glanced at the Space Marines. Their focus was still on him, not the Tyrannid, not yet. He had to exploit that. "All right, new plan," Tony broadcasted, his voice laced with desperate urgency. "The enemy of my enemy as well, still our enemy, but less immediate. We need to create a distraction, a big one." The Hive Tyrant, now fully emerged, was a hulking terror of chitin and muscle, easily 50 feet tall, its scythe claws dripping with unknown fluids. It surveyed the chamber with an alien intelligence, its multifaceted eyes sweeping over the Space Marines and then, dismissively, over Tony and Peter. It let out another deafening shriek, a challenge. The smaller swarm creatures, the dog-sized arachnids, seemed to respond to its command. They stopped their assault on Tony, turning their chittering attention towards the Space Marines, creating a living tide between the two groups of combatants. This was it, the forced alliance, the unexpected threat reveal. "Pete, you see those massive power conduits running along the upper walls?" Tony pointed with a laser sight, his voice strained. "We need to overload them. All of them. Create a chain reaction. Blow this whole section to Kingdom Come. Blow it up." "But that's suicidal, Mr. Stark. And what if it doesn't even hurt that thing?" Peter protested, his voice high with fear. "It's our only play, kid. We can't fight them, but maybe we can bury them, or at least distract them long enough to find a way out," Tony argued, already boosting himself towards the nearest conduit. "I'll start with this one. You hit the one directly across from me. We need to hit them simultaneously, or the charge won't build enough." The Space Marines, sensing the shift in dynamics, finally acknowledged the Tyrannid. One of them roared, a battle cry in an unknown language, and raised its bolt gun, firing a volley of explosive shells at the monstrous creature. The shells detonated against the Hive Tyrant's chitinous hide, leaving shallow scorch marks but no discernible damage. The Tyrannid merely shrieked, annoyed. The other two Space Marines, however, turned their attention back to Tony and Peter. They recognized the intent. An attempt to sabotage the ship itself. Traitors. One of them boomed, its voice filled with righteous fury. "You conspire with the Xenos. You will be purged." They opened fire. Bolt gun rounds slammed into the walls around Tony and Peter, forcing them to move, making their task even more difficult. The Hive Tyrant, now fully engaged, began to stalk towards the Space Marines, its massive scythe claws slicing through the smaller swarm creatures that got in its way. "Now, Pete, go! Hit it on my mark!" Tony shouted, bracing himself against a powerful bolt gun explosion that rocked his armor. He could feel the conduit vibrating under his touch, the raw power humming within it. Peter, though terrified, responded with his characteristic bravery. He launched himself across the vast bay, dodging bolt gun fire, weaving through debris, heading for the opposite conduit. His spider sense was an incessant clamor, but he pushed through it. "Ready, Mr. Stark," Peter yelled, his web fluid already prepared to wrap around the conduit, creating a makeshift short-circuiting device. "On three. 1, 2, 3. Tony roared, slamming his armored fist into the conduit, forcing a massive overload. Sparks erupted, electricity arced, and the conduit began to glow a dangerous, unstable blue. Simultaneously, Peter pulled back with all his might, tearing open the conduit on his side. A similar burst of raw, violent energy exploded outwards. The chain reaction began. The entire industrial bay began to overload. Massive transformers exploded, power lines snapped, and the very structure of the ship screamed in protest. The ceiling lights exploded, plunging the chamber into chaotic, flickering darkness, illuminated only by the violent arcing of raw energy. The Hive Tyrant roared in fury, momentarily disoriented by the chaos. The Space Marines, caught in the inferno, shielded themselves, their power armor glowing ominously. Narration. In that deafening, blinding inferno, two heroes from another reality had gambled everything. They had bought themselves a chance, a sliver of hope, by turning two impossible enemies against each other, setting a death trap that threatened to consume them all. But this was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead, in the heart of this dying, monstrous vessel. Tony, half blinded by the explosions, could barely make out Peter's silhouette. He pushed his failing thrusters to their absolute limit, trying to reach a higher, stable platform, any escape route. The ship was tearing itself apart. He knew, with a horrifying certainty, that they had only just traded one impossible threat for another. They had to get out. They had to survive. As the floor beneath him buckled, sending him tumbling into a new, unexplored section of the collapsing ship, the last thing he saw was the Space Marines and the Tyranid Hive Tyrant. Now fully engaged in a brutal, universe-shaking battle, their roars and weapon fire swallowed by the ship's death throes. Tony plummeted, a powerless meteor in a collapsing world. The industrial bay, now a cacophony of screeching metal and arcing electricity, vanished above him. He bounced off twisted girders, slammed into buckled plating, his armor groaning under the brutal impacts. Warning lights flared anew, the fragile 10% power dipping even lower. Every instinct screamed, every fiber of his being focused on survival. He couldn't control his fall, a prisoner of gravity and the ship's furious death throes. Then, the floor gave way entirely. He plunged into an abyssal darkness, the sound of the ship tearing itself apart, echoing around him like a dying scream. He hit something resilient, a massive, flexible cable that momentarily snagged him, then snapped. He hit again, a glancing blow off what felt like a giant turbine housing, ricocheting wildly. He was completely disoriented, spinning through pure, unseeing black. Friday! Status! He gasped, trying to orient himself, fighting against the nausea. Critical hull breaches in multiple sections, boss. Atmospheric pressure rapidly fluctuating. Structural integrity at 0. Your armor is sustaining severe damage. Power now at 3% and falling. Friday's voice was clipped, a stark indicator of the gravity of their situation. No contact with Spider-Man. Last known location was the industrial bay, moments before the major collapse. Peter, the kid. Tony's heart clenched. He had to find him. His descent finally ended with a bone-jarring impact on a sloped, uneven surface. He slid for several agonizing seconds, tumbling over debris before finally coming to a halt. Every joint in his armor screamed in protest. He lay there, disoriented, aching, trying to take stock. Slowly, the dim, emergency lights of his helmet flickered back to life, painting a fractured landscape in a weak, blue glow. He was in a vast, cavernous space, far larger than any he had seen so far. The ceiling, if it could be called that, was miles above, a jagged expanse of twisted metal and exposed conduits. Below him, an impossibly deep chasm stretched into inky blackness. He was on a ledge, a narrow sliver of stability in an otherwise ruined world. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of burnt metal and something else, a faint, sweet, cloying odor that made the hairs on his neck stand up. He pushed himself to his feet, his armor complaining with every movement. Friday, anything. Life signs? Peter, scanning the sheer amount of interference from the structural collapse and residual energy signatures is overwhelming, boss. Local scans are compromised. Long-range scans are offline. I can detect no coherent life signs within a 1-kilometer radius. No coherent life signs. That didn't mean Peter was gone, but it didn't mean he was safe either. He could be buried, unconscious, or worse. Tony's mind raced. He was an engineer, a problem solver, and his biggest problem right now was finding Peter and getting them both out of this hellscape. He activated his suit's external speakers, hoping the comms weren't completely dead. Peter, can you hear me? Report in! He repeated it several times, his voice echoing eerily in the vast, silent chamber. Only silence answered him. He activated the dim optical flare in his palm, sweeping the light across the colossal cavern. It was a factory, he realized, but on a scale that dwarfed anything on Earth. Massive, derelict machines, gantries and platforms stretched as far as the eye could see, swallowed by the gloom. This was where the Space Marines built their gargantuan weaponry, or perhaps repaired their ships. The sense of ancient, brutal industry was palpable. Suddenly, a low, guttural, chittering sound, faint but distinct, reached his ears. It wasn't Friday's voice. It came from the darkness below him, from the chasm. Tony froze, his heart hammering. He wasn't alone. He swept the light downwards. In the gloom, a pair of malevolent green eyes, like tiny emeralds, glinted back. Then another pair, and another. The swarms, the dog-sized, arachnid-like creatures that had assaulted him in the industrial bay. And there were hundreds, thousands of them, clambering up the sheer cliff face of the chasm, their claws clicking against the metal. "Damn it," Tony muttered, pushing his thrusters to their absolute minimum, attempting a feeble jump towards a slightly higher ledge. His armor protested, sparking, but he made it, scrambling up with a grunt. He needed to get away from these things, find high ground, and most importantly, find Peter. He activated his internal comms again, a desperate plea. "Peter, if you're out there, just make a sound. Anything." No answer. The chittering grew louder, a wave of green eyes climbing towards him. Tony was trapped on a narrow ledge, the vast chasm on one side, a sheer, impassable wall on the other. He had to keep moving, keep hoping. He noticed a barely visible maintenance ladder, half collapsed but potentially climbable, leading upwards into the shadows. It was his only way forward. With a deep breath, Tony began to climb, his injured armor scraping against the cold metal, the distant chittering of the swarm a constant, terrifying reminder of his precarious situation. Peter Parker awoke to the sensation of falling, followed by the jarring reality of being suspended upside down. His head throbbed, his vision blurred. He hung by a single tattered web line, caught on a jagged piece of twisted metal, swaying precariously over an impossible abyss. Below him, a chaotic landscape of crumpled gantries and broken machinery stretched into the gloom. Above, through a gaping hole in the hull, he could see faint, malevolent stars. "Ow!" he groaned, his voice hoarse. His suit was scorched, torn in several places, and his spider lens was cracked even further, obscuring his vision. His spider sense was a dull, persistent ache in the back of his mind. No longer a scream, but a low, terrifying hum. "Mr. Stark," he called out, his voice weak. "Friday, anyone?" Only the distant groaning of the dying ship answered him. A mournful symphony of destruction. He was alone. He tried to right himself, his muscles screaming in protest. He managed to grab a piece of stable-looking debris, pulling himself up, hand over hand, until he was no longer upside down. He clung to the metal, his heart hammering against his ribs, adrenaline slowly pushing back the pain and disorientation. He scanned his surroundings, his damaged eyes trying to piece together the chaos. He was in a massive, disused cargo bay, one even larger than the industrial processing bay they had just escaped. Immense, empty cargo containers, some half-crushed, littered the floor like forgotten toys. The air was thick with dust and the metallic tang of ruin. His comms were dead, completely. No static, no Friday, no Mr. Stark. He was truly isolated. A wave of panic, cold and absolute, washed over him. He was just a kid in an alien universe, completely alone. He fought it down. Mr. Stark wouldn't want him to panic. He would want him to be smart, to be Spider-Man, but first priority, find Mr. Stark. Second, figure out where they were and how to get out. He carefully disengaged his damaged web line and dropped onto a large, relatively stable cargo container below. His spider sense, though dulled, began to prickle. Not an immediate threat, but a generalized unease, like he was being watched, or that something was just off. He moved with caution, his feet light on the metal. The cargo bay was a maze, a labyrinth of shadows and towering containers. He used his remaining web fluid sparingly, swinging from container to container, trying to gain a vantage point. He couldn't see any obvious way out, just more collapsed sections and impassable walls. Then he saw it. A faint, flickering light in the distance, deep within the cargo bay. It was too regular to be an electrical short. It was a human light, or at least a light source that wasn't part of the alien ship. Could it be Mr. Stark? Hope surged through him, chasing away the dread. He started moving towards it, faster now, leaping across gaps, his eyes fixed on the distant glow. The spider sense hummed, a low thrum of anticipation mixed with lingering caution. As he drew closer, the light solidified into a dull blue glow emanating from behind a stack of immense, derelict containers. He approached cautiously, ready for anything. He peered around the edge of the containers. It wasn't Mr. Stark, it was a figure clad in the same terrifying skull-faced power armor as the first Space Marine. It was massive, imposing even in its stillness. Its dark green and bronze armor was chipped and scarred, but mostly intact. It was kneeling before a makeshift altar, a collection of broken machinery and twisted metal, arranged in a grotesque, reverent manner. The blue light came from a single, flickering candle, illuminating strange, unsettling symbols carved into the armor plating of the kneeling warrior. And in its gauntleted hands, it held something small, something organic, a severed human head, its eyes wide with a silent scream. Peter froze, every muscle taut. His spider sense, which had been a dull thrum, now flared with a violent, agonizing shriek, a cacophony of absolute terror. This wasn't just a warrior. This was something far, far worse. A monster engaged in a blasphemous ritual. The Space Marine, sensing his presence, slowly lifted its head, its glowing red lenses fixed on Peter, burning into his very soul. A low, guttural growl rumbled from its helmet, a sound of ancient, unholy rage. Peter knew, with chilling certainty, that he had stumbled upon something he was never meant to see, and now, he was its next sacrifice. Tony continued his slow, painful ascent up the maintenance ladder. His armor protested with every movement, the metal groaning, the internal systems flickering. Below him, the chittering of the swarm grew louder, hundreds of tiny, razor-sharp claws scraping against the metal, their malevolent green eyes gleaming in the gloom. They were climbing, relentless, like a wave of living nightmares. Friday, what's my ETA to a stable platform? And what's above me? Tony gritted out, his breath heavy. His muscles ached, but he couldn't stop. Approximately 25 meters to a primary ventilation shaft, boss. It leads to a high-altitude observation deck. Scans indicate potential structural integrity in that section. However, I am detecting a large, inert energy signature directly above you, embedded in the shaft. Unknown composition. Inert? What does that mean exactly? Tony asked, forcing another painful upward surge. It means it's not active, boss. Not emitting power or life signs. But it's there, and it's massive. Tony didn't like the sound of that. Any sign of Peter yet? Negative, boss. Still no coherent life signs within range. The swarm was getting closer. He could hear their individual clicks and chitters now. A chilling symphony of predator and prey. He risked a glance down. Hundreds of green eyes stared up at him. A living carpet of chitin and hate. He had to speed up. He reached the primary ventilation shaft, a circular tunnel about 10 feet in diameter. It was dark, choked with dust, and stretched upwards into the absolute blackness. He pulled himself in, his armor scraping against the metal, momentarily safe from the climbing swarm. All right, Friday. Where's this inert thing? Directly above you, boss, approximately 10 meters into the shaft. It appears to be a large cylindrical object, roughly 5 meters in length and 3 meters in diameter. Non-ferrous, extremely dense, and it's coated in a layer of something organic. Organic? Tony frowned. This ship kept getting weirder. He activated his optical flares, aiming them upwards into the shaft. The light illuminated a truly bizarre sight. Embedded in the center of the ventilation shaft, wedged tightly, was a massive cylindrical cocoon. It was made of thick, pulsating, sickly green tissue, interlaced with black veins that seemed to squirm beneath the surface. It looked like something out of a horror movie, something that shouldn't exist. What in the is that, a giant bug egg? Tony whispered, revulsion churning in his gut. Unknown, boss. Biological scans are inconclusive. The organic material is unlike anything in our databases. It is generating a faint rhythmic pulse, but no discernible life signs. A faint rhythmic pulse, but no life signs. Friday, that just doesn't track, Tony argued, eyeing the grotesque cocoon with deep suspicion. He carefully ascended the shaft, trying to keep his distance from the pulsating mass. As he drew closer, the sickeningly sweet smell from before intensified, cloying and heavy in the stale air. He could see faint, swirling patterns within the green tissue, like blood vessels or something moving just beneath the surface. Then, he heard a new sound, a sound that made his blood run cold, a wet, tearing sound coming from inside the cocoon. "Friday, tell me that thing isn't hatching," Tony breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "Warning, boss. Internal pressure readings within the object are increasing exponentially. Molecular bonds are destabilizing. It appears it is hatching." The green tissue began to visibly ripple, then tear. A thick, viscous fluid, black and glistening, oozed from the ruptures. The wet tearing grew louder, faster. Something was pushing from within. Something powerful, something alive. Tony backed away as quickly as he could in the confined space, his thrusters too weak for any real speed. He needed to get out of this shaft, now. With a final, sickening "RIP," the cocoon tore open. A monstrous, multi-limbed creature, larger than any of the swarm arachnids, erupted from within. It was insectile, with a segmented body, a nightmare of chitin and razor-sharp claws. Its head was a mass of writhing tendrils and black, unblinking eyes. It was roughly the size of a small car, and it let out a piercing shriek that echoed deafeningly in the enclosed shaft. "What in the actual hell?" Tony yelled, momentarily stunned by the sudden, horrifying emergence. Analysis complete, boss. Categorizing as a Tyrannid warrior bioform. Threat level, high. Weapons, bioplasma cannon on its right arm, rending claws on its left. The Tyrannid warrior turned its attention to Tony, its black eyes fixing on him with predatory intent. Its bioplasma cannon began to glow with an ominous, sickly green light. Tony was trapped. Below, the swarm was still climbing. Above, a fresh, terrifying Tyrannid warrior had just hatched, blocking his escape, and it was ready to fire. And his armor was practically dead. He was a sardine in a can, facing a monster. His fight for survival had just taken a very personal and very terrifying turn. Peter felt the Space Marine's gaze, burning into him, stripping away his anonymity. The glowing red lenses were portals to an ancient, unfeeling malevolence. He knew with a primal certainty that he was utterly outmatched. His spider sense shrieked, 1,000 warnings converging into one deafening roar. He had two options: fight and die, or run and maybe die. He chose the latter. He launched himself backwards, a blur of red and blue, ricocheting off the stack of containers. The Space Marine roared, a sound of frustrated fury, and brought its massive chainsword around in a wide, sweeping arc. The motorized teeth screamed as they tore through the steel containers Peter had just left, shredding them like paper. Peter didn't look back. He web-zipped, swung, and scrambled through the labyrinth of containers, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and the terrifying warrior. He was fast, agile, but the Space Marine was relentless, its heavy boots shaking the ground with every thudding step. Explosive bolt gun rounds began to slam into the containers around him, each blast echoing like thunder, sending shrapnel flying. Peter dodged, weaved, and somersaulted, his spider sense his only guide through the chaos. He risked a glance back. The Space Marine wasn't running, it was walking, its pace deliberate, its aim chillingly precise. It was enjoying the hunt. Come on, where's a way out?" Peter muttered to himself, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was pushing his suit and his body to their absolute limits. The fear was a cold knot in his stomach, but the urge to survive, to find Mr. Stark, was stronger. He spotted a narrow gap between two colossal containers, barely wide enough for his body. It looked like it led to a deeper, darker part of the cargo bay. It was a gamble, but he had no other choice. He dove through, scraping his suit on the jagged edges, bursting into a pitch-black corridor on the other side. He didn't stop. He ran blindly, trusting his spider sense to guide him. The corridor was long, desolate, lined with smaller locked compartments. The silence here was oppressive. broken only by his own ragged breathing and the distant fading thud of the Space Marine's boots. He had gained some ground. He fumbled for his web shooters, checking his fluid levels. Critically low. He wouldn't have many more swings left. And his comms were still dead. He felt truly alone. Then, a new sound reached him. Faint but distinct. A high-pitched, chittering sound coming from one of the locked compartments. It was familiar. Too familiar. The swarms. His spider sense began to hum again. A low, generalized warning. He slowed, approaching the compartment cautiously. It was a reinforced storage locker, its door sealed tight. But from within, he could hear the distinct sound of movement, the scuttling of many small, kittenous bodies. He peered through a small, grimy viewport on the door. Inside, in the dimness, hundreds of the dog-sized arachnid creatures swarmed over each other, a writhing, living carpet of malevolent green eyes. They were agitated, scratching at the reinforced walls, trying to get out. It seemed this was some kind of storage or holding pen for the creatures. Suddenly, a larger shadow moved within the swarm. A different creature, larger, more menacing. It was roughly 8 feet tall, bipedal, with massive scythe-like claws and a bulbous, fanged head. It moved with a disturbing grace, pushing aside the smaller swarm creatures as it stalked the perimeter of the chamber. Narration. Peter's blood ran cold. He recognized it. It was a Tyrannid warrior, like the one Tony had just faced in the ventilation shaft. Another nightmare unleashed, and this one was trapped, but clearly aware of his presence. Its multifaceted eyes fixed on the door, on him. The Tyrannid warrior let out a low, guttural shriek, a sound of pure hunger, and slammed its massive scythe claw against the reinforced door, rattling it violently. It seemed aware that Peter was on the other side, and it wanted out. Peter backed away slowly, silently. He was trapped between a rampaging space marine behind him and a locked compartment full of Tyrannid horrors in front of him. This ship was a death trap, a multi-layered nightmare. Then, a flicker of an idea. A desperate, dangerous idea. He looked at the sealed door, then back at the faint sounds of the space marines still searching for him in the distance. He had to make a choice. He could try to find another way, but he was running out of time and out of web fluid. Or he could play a different kind of game. He cautiously approached the reinforced door again, his mind racing. He noticed the lock mechanism. A heavy, ancient-looking contraption. If he could open it, his spider sense throbbed, warning him against it. This was playing with fire, unleashing a monster. But the Space Marine was a known implacable threat. The Tyrannid warrior, for all its horror, was an unknown quantity, a force of nature. And two forces of nature, unleashed against each other, often cancelled each other out. He had to take the risk. He had to turn this ship's monsters against themselves, just like Mr. Stark had. He began to carefully examine the lock, his nimble fingers tracing the ancient mechanisms. This was a Hail Mary, a last-ditch effort. He needed a distraction. A big one. Tony stood his ground in the ventilation shaft, facing the newly hatched Tyrannid warrior. Its bioplasma cannon glowed an angry green, charging with raw, destructive energy. There was no escape. Friday, any weaknesses? Any vulnerabilities? Tony demanded, his voice tight. Negative, boss. Chitinous armor plating is exceptionally durable. Internal systems are redundant. The bioplasma cannon will likely penetrate your depleted shields and armor. Wonderful, Tony muttered, bracing himself. He had one, maybe two, pitiful bursts of thruster power left. He had to make them count. The Tyrannid warrior shrieked, a sound of pure, unadulterated hunger, and fired its bioplasma cannon. A torrent of raw green energy erupted from its arm, filling the narrow shaft. Tony reacted on pure instinct. He unleashed his remaining thruster power, not to dodge, but to launch himself directly towards the creature, at an angle. The bioplasma blast seared past his left shoulder, melting a section of the shaft wall, but missing him. He slammed into the Tyrannid warrior's chest, a desperate, futile tackle. The impact was jarring, more like hitting a brick wall than a living creature. The Tyrannid warrior barely flinched. Its rending claws, however, snapped shut, aiming for Tony's helmet. He twisted, using his failing thrusters for a last-ditch maneuver, and felt the claws scrape uselessly against his chest plate. Narration. This was not a fight. This was a struggle for mere inches, a desperate dance with death in a confined space. Tony was a cornered animal, using every ounce of his wit and remaining power to simply not be eviscerated. He needed a way out. He needed a distraction. His eyes scanned the shaft, desperately searching. Below, the swarm was still climbing, their chittering growing louder, their green eyes now visible at the very bottom of the shaft. Hundreds of them, a carpet of hungry death. Above him, the Tyrannid warrior was pushing him back, its massive strength overwhelming his own. Then he saw it, a faint glimmer of light, far above, filtering down from what Friday had called the high-altitude observation deck. It was too high to reach with his failing thrusters, too far to climb quickly, but it was there, an escape route. He had to get past this thing. He had to. He remembered Friday's earlier words. The organic material is unlike anything in our databases. It is generating a faint rhythmic pulse, but no discernible life signs. And the sickeningly sweet smell. Could it be vulnerable to something specific? Tony knew the Tyrannids were bioweapons, organisms designed for war. And organisms, no matter how powerful, had weaknesses. What if the very act of hatching had weakened it? He focused his suit's last remaining internal scanner on the Tyrannid warrior. Friday-specific vulnerabilities? Anything, no matter how small. Scanning boss. Elevated temperature readings detected around the bioplasma cannon's energy cell. It appears the rapid energy discharge of hatching and immediate firing has caused a localized overheating. A sustained, precise impact could potentially destabilize it. A precise impact. With what? He had no weapons. His repulsors were dead. He was in a metal can, fighting a living tank. His gaze fell on the collapsing pieces of the cocoon that still clung to the shaft walls. Thick, sticky organic matter, and the black, viscous fluid that had oozed from it. What if that fluid was volatile or corrosive? It was a long shot, a desperate one, but he had no other options. He pushed back against the Tyrannid warrior with all his strength, using his dying thrusters for a fraction of a second to create just enough space. The creature hissed, annoyed by his resistance, its claws still snapping. Tony then used another desperate burst of thruster power, not to escape, but to launch himself past the Tyrannid warrior towards the far wall of the shaft. He slammed his armored hand into the wall, activating his last optical flare, aiming it at the remains of the cocoon. The light illuminated the glistening black fluid dripping from the tattered cocoon material. He saw it, a small pool of the viscous liquid collecting on a ledge just above the creature's shoulder. He had to get to it, and he had to get it onto that overheating bioplasma cannon. The Tyrannid warrior, momentarily confused by his sudden, reckless maneuver, turned its head, its black eyes fixing on him again. It charged its bioplasma cannon, the sickly green glow intensifying. Tony didn't hesitate. He launched himself off the wall, using his remaining thruster energy for one last, desperate leap, aiming for the pool of black fluid. He grabbed a fistful of the viscous material, ignoring the repulsive feel, and hurled it with all his strength towards the Tyrannid warrior's bioplasma cannon, which was now fully charged and about to fire. The black fluid hit the cannon with a sickening splat, coating the glowing energy cell. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, a faint hiss, a tremor ran through the Tyrannid warrior. The green glow of its cannon flickered, then intensified wildly, turning a dangerous, unstable white. The creature shrieked, a sound of agony and confusion, its body spasming. "Warning, boss! Volatile reaction detected. The organic fluid is acting as a highly corrosive catalyst, rapidly accelerating the energy cell's destabilization." "Get clear," Friday yelled. Tony didn't need to be told twice. He pushed off the Tyrannid warrior with his feet, using its thrashing body as a springboard, launching himself upwards towards the faint light of the observation deck. His armor screamed, sparks flying, but he was moving, gaining precious distance. Behind him, with a deafening boom, the Tyranid warrior's bioplasma cannon exploded. The force of the blast ripped through its arm, tearing through its chitinous armor, throwing it against the shaft wall. Black and green blood splattered everywhere. The creature shrieked again, a dying scream as it fell, tumbling downwards, disappearing into the darkness of the chasm below, taking the climbing swarm with it in a cascade of debris and organic matter. Tony scrambled, pulled, and dragged himself out of the ventilation shaft, collapsing onto the floor of the observation deck. He lay there gasping, every muscle aching, his armor smoking. He was alive, he had survived. But he was more vulnerable than ever. His power was gone, his armor was mangled, and Peter was still missing. He pushed himself up, his eyes scanning the new environment. It was an observation deck, as Friday had said, but it was massive, circular, with immense fractured windows looking out into the void. The light was dim, sickly, coming from distant emergency fixtures, and in the center of the deck, on a raised dais, sat a single, massive, ornate chair. It was a throne, clearly, designed for a being of immense stature, studded with strange gems and alien iconography, and on it something was sitting, something large, something still, something waiting. Peter, his heart hammering against his ribs, focused on the ancient lock mechanism of the Tyranid swarm compartment. He had to be quick, precise. One wrong move, and he was either dead by Space Marine or dead by swarm. His nimble fingers worked furiously, guided by his sharp intellect and a lifetime of tinkering with electronics and mechanics. He bypassed a rudimentary pressure plate, disconnected a series of ancient, corroded wires, and then, with a delicate touch, manipulated a complex tumbler system. It was crude but effective. He felt a satisfying click. The heavy, reinforced door shuddered. Peter held his breath, pressing himself against the adjacent container, hidden in the shadows. A moment of agonizing silence stretched. Then, with a low metallic groan, the door began to slowly swing inwards. The Tyranid warrior inside, which had been pressing itself against the door, snarled with anticipation, its multifaceted eyes, burning with hunger, instantly fixed on the opening. The smaller swarm creatures behind it chittered excitedly, a wave of green eyes and clicking claws. Peter took a deep, shaky breath. Now for the bait. He didn't make a sound. Instead, he reached into one of his utility pouches, pulling out a small, spherical web bomb. He'd designed it for a different kind of distraction, a different kind of enemy. This was a whole new level. He timed it perfectly. As the door opened just enough for a creature to squeeze through, he activated the web bomb and hurled it with all his might, not into the compartment, but away from it, towards the very end of the long corridor. It hit a derelict piece of machinery with a thwip and then burst, releasing a sticky, expanding cloud of webbing. The Tyranid warrior hesitated for a split second, its alien senses processing the sudden loud disturbance. Then, with a guttural shriek, it lunged, bursting through the now open door, followed by a torrent of smaller swarm creatures. They poured out, a living tide of hunger and rage, surging down the corridor towards the source of the noise. Peter watched them go, a chilling wave of relief washing over him. It had worked. He had unleashed a monster, but it was heading in the right direction. Towards the Space Marine, he didn't waste a second. He turned and sprinted back the way he had come, his spider sense still throbbing with residual warnings. He had bought himself time, precious fleeting time. He heard it then. The distinct, heavy thudding of the Space Marine's boots, now much closer, coming from the direction he had just come from. It had circled back, picking up his trail, and then he heard the roar, a new sound, a sound of utter, unholy rage. The Space Marine had found the Tyranids. Peter didn't stop to listen. He web-zipped up to the highest available cargo container, then launched himself across the vast cargo bay, moving with renewed urgency. He had to find Mr. Stark. He had to. He reached the far side of the cargo bay, scrambling up a precarious stack of containers until he was high above the floor. From his vantage point, he could see the entire ruined expanse. He searched desperately for any sign of his mentor, and then he saw it. a faint, flickering blue light far above him, emanating from a massive circular window. It was high, almost impossibly high, but it was there, and it was exactly the kind of light Mr. Stark's armor would give off, even when failing. Hope surged through him again, mixed with a chilling new apprehension. He had a target, a direction, but getting there was another matter entirely. The path was a vertical climb up sheer damaged walls, through what looked like a maze of crumbling service ducts and corroded pipes. He started climbing, his web shooters now almost completely dry, his muscles screaming. The sounds of battle, the roar of the Space Marine, the shriek of the Tyranids, the rhythmic thump-thump of bolt gun fire, were now a distant, terrible symphony echoing through the ship. He just hoped they were distracting each other long enough for him to reach Mr. Stark. He was Spider-Man. He could do this. He had to do this. Tony stared at the figure on the throne. It was colossal, at least 15 feet tall, clad in intricate, archaic armor, dark grey with gold filigree. But it was not a Space Marine. Its posture was one of regal authority, but it seemed deactivated, inert. Its helmet was a stylized eagle's head, and from within its visor, a faint, golden light pulsed, like a dying ember. It sat absolutely still, unmoving, radiating an aura of immense, ancient power, even in its deactivated state. "Friday, who or what is that?" Tony whispered, his voice hushed. This was different. This wasn't just a warrior. This felt like a god. Analysis incomplete, boss. Energy signature is unique, unlike anything previously encountered. The golden light emanates from an internal power source that is severely depleted, but still active. It is sentient, but dormant, cataloging as Ancient Guardian, unknown affiliation. Tony took a cautious step forward. The air around the throne felt strangely still, almost sacred. Despite the chaos of the collapsing ship, this chamber seemed untouched, preserved in a bubble of silent reverence. He noticed the throne was positioned perfectly to overlook the vast, star-strewn void outside the fractured windows. Then, a new sound, far away, faint but growing. A rhythmic thudding and a high-pitched chittering. The familiar sounds of the Space Marines and the Tyrant Tony stared at the figure on the throne. It was colossal, at least 15 feet tall, clad in intricate, archaic armor, dark grey with gold filigree. But it was not a Space Marine. Its posture was one of regal authority, but it seemed deactivated, inert. Its helmet was a stylized eagle's head, and from within its visor, a faint, golden light pulsed, like a dying ember. It sat absolutely still, unmoving, radiating an aura of immense, ancient power, even in its deactivated state. "Friday, who or what is that?" Tony whispered, his voice hushed. This was different. This wasn't just a warrior. This felt like a god. Analysis incomplete, boss. Energy signature is unique, unlike anything previously encountered. The golden light emanates from an internal power source that is severely depleted, but still active. It is sentient, but dormant, cataloging as Ancient Guardian, unknown affiliation. Tony took a cautious step forward. The air around the throne felt strangely still, almost sacred. Despite the chaos of the collapsing ship, this chamber seemed untouched, preserved in a bubble of silent reverence. He noticed the throne was positioned perfectly to overlook the vast, star-strewn void outside the fractured windows. Then, a new sound, far away, faint but growing. A rhythmic thudding and a high-pitched chittering, the familiar sounds of the Space Marines and the Tyranid swarms. They were drawing closer. The battle in the industrial bay was either over or moving, and it was moving towards him. Tony looked from the inert Guardian to the fractured windows, then to the entrance of the observation deck. He was trapped on a high-altitude platform, and soon he'd be caught between two unstoppable forces. He couldn't fight them, not in his current state. He needed a plan, and fast. His eyes fell back on the Ancient Guardian. Friday, what about its power source? Can it be activated? Manipulated? The energy output is extremely stable, boss, despite its depletion. However, its core is resonating with a unique frequency. Theoretically, if an external energy pulse of similar composition were introduced, it could initiate a full system restart. Similar composition? Tony mused, his mind already racing. Like a jump start? What kind of energy? Psychic, boss, or more accurately, psionic. The residual energy signatures within this vessel are primarily psychic in nature, but the Guardian's is pure, concentrated, and highly refined. Psychic energy. Tony blinked. Great. So unless I sprout a third eye and learn to bend spoons with my mind, that's a non-starter. He gritted his teeth. This universe just kept throwing curveballs. He needed to find Peter. He couldn't be stuck here when the Space Marines and Tyranids arrived. Suddenly, a faint but distinct sound, a frantic thwip from one of the immense fractured windows. Tony spun around, his heart leaping. There, clinging to the sheer ruined wall outside, was a familiar figure, red and blue, battered but unmistakably Peter. Spider-Man. Peter! Tony yelled, his voice rough with relief and urgency. He limped towards the window, activating his minimal thrusters to cover the distance faster. Peter, seeing Tony, let out a shaky sigh of relief. He scrambled through a small, jagged opening in the glass, tumbling onto the observation deck. He was covered in grime, his suit torn but alive. Mr. Stark! Oh my God, you're okay. Peter gasped, stumbling towards him, his exhaustion evident. I thought you were gone. The whole ship came apart. I'm fine, kid. Mostly, Tony replied, a rare, genuine smile gracing his lips, quickly replaced by a grim expression as he glanced at the approaching sounds of battle. But we've got company and a new problem. He gestured to the colossal Guardian on the throne. Peter followed his gaze, his eyes widening in awe and apprehension. His spider sense, which had been a persistent ache, now pulsed with renewed intensity. Whoa, what is that? Friday calls it an ancient Guardian, dormant, but something tells me it won't be for long if this ship doesn't hold together. Tony explained, scanning the Guardian with what little power he had left. It needs a psychic jumpstart, apparently, to fully activate. The thudding footsteps and chittering growls grew louder, closer. They were almost at the entrance to the observation deck. We don't have time, Mr. Stark. They're coming! Peter cried, his eyes darting frantically between the entrance and the Guardian. The Space Marine I lured, it's a big one, and it's really, really mad. I can imagine, Tony grunted. All right, Peter, listen closely. You're agile, you're fast. We need to create a barrier, something to buy us time. Think structural weak points, anything that can delay them. Just as Tony finished speaking, the reinforced doors leading to the observation deck were violently torn open. Two Space Marines, one of them the massive, chainsword-wielding warrior Peter had encountered, stormed into the chamber. Their armor was scorched, dented, but their rage was palpable. Behind them, hundreds of the smaller Tyranid swarms poured in, a chittering, green-eyed tide. But they weren't alone. Another titanic figure emerged, a Tyranid hive tyrant, even larger than the first, its scythe claws dripping, its multifaceted eyes burning with predatory intelligence. It had clearly followed the Space Marines, sensing new prey. The observation deck became a pressure cooker of alien fury. The Space Marines instantly identified Tony and Peter, their prime targets. The Tyranid hive tyrant, however, focused on the Space Marines, seeing them as direct competition for biomass. The smaller swarms, guided by the hive tyrant, began to spread out, chittering aggressively. Narration. The final stage of their nightmare had begun. Two impossible enemies, now joined by a third, converging on two lone, battered heroes, with a dormant god figure at their back. The choice was no longer about escape. It was about survival, and perhaps a desperate final gamble. Peter, now! Tony yelled, pointing towards massive, ornate pillars that supported the observation deck's ceiling. Web those pillars. Create choke points. We need to separate them. Peter, despite his exhaustion, leaped into action. He launched web lines with incredible speed, not to snare the enemies, but to strategically reinforce and weaken the pillars, creating intricate web barriers and tripwires, forcing the swarms and even the Space Marines to slow down, to navigate around his traps. His web fluid was almost completely depleted, but he made every shot count. Meanwhile, Tony, with his last vestiges of power, fired a single, desperate repulsor blast at a weakened section of the floor, creating a small, localized collapse. It was pitiful, but it forced the Space Marines to adjust their path. Buying precious seconds, the Space Marines, momentarily frustrated by Peter's tactics, began firing their bolt guns, not at Peter, but at the web barriers, trying to clear a path. The Tyranid Hive Tyrant roared, lunging past the Space Marines, tearing through the smaller swarms in its haste to reach its prey. It saw the heroes, but it also saw the Space Marines as immediate aggressive threats. The battle erupted, fierce and brutal, in the entrance to the observation deck. Bolt gun fire, the screams of the Chainsword, the chittering of the swarms, and the ear-splitting shrieks of the Hive Tyrant mingled into a symphony of destruction. The ship shuddered under the impacts. Tony watched, heart in his throat, as Peter, having exhausted his web fluid, scrambled back towards him, barely dodging a massive swing from the Hive Tyrant's scythe claw. "Mr. Stark, they're too many. We can't hold them." "I know, kid. I have an idea. But it's insane," Tony yelled, his eyes fixed on the ancient Guardian. "Friday, what happens if that Guardian fully activates? What's its power output?" "If fully active, boss, its power output would be immense, potentially capable of localized reality manipulation, or, at minimum, a massive focused psychic blast. It is a weapon, boss, a weapon of unimaginable power." "Good. That's what I like to hear." Tony turned to Peter. "Peter, I need you to do something incredibly dangerous. I need you to climb onto that throne, onto the Guardian, and I need you to touch it, right where that golden light is pulsing." Peter's eyes widened, his spider sense flaring violently. "Touch it? But what if it's dangerous? What if it fries me? It's completely inert. That's the point, Pete. It needs a spark, a living sentient spark. We have no psychic powers, but you have something else, something unique." Tony's gaze was intense, desperate. "Your spider sense. It's a manifestation of a heightened neurosensitivity, a connection to a larger web of causality. It's a psychic phenomenon in its own way. If anything can jumpstart it, it's you." Peter looked from the monstrous battle raging just feet away to the inert Guardian, then back to Tony. He understood. It was a long shot, a crazy gamble, but it was their only chance. "Okay, Mr. Stark, but if I turn into a giant golden statue..." "You owe me a lifetime supply of churros," Peter said, a tremor in his voice, but a defiant glint in his eyes. He started to move towards the throne, scaling the dais with newfound determination. The Space Marines and the Hive Tyrant, now fully engaged in their brutal dance of death, paid them no mind. They were too busy tearing each other apart. The observation deck was a maelstrom of destruction, bolt gun fire meeting chitinous armor, chainswords clashing against scythe claws. Peter reached the throne, his hand trembling as he reached out towards the glowing golden ember in the Guardian's eagle-head visor. His spider sense screamed, a violent, piercing shriek that threatened to overwhelm him. Every fiber of his being told him to run, to retreat, but he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and pushed his hand forward, pressing his palm directly against the golden light. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a jolt, a flash of blinding, golden light erupted from the Guardian. It wasn't a mere flicker anymore. It was a blinding, pure energy pulse that filled the entire observation deck, forcing Tony to shield his eyes. Peter cried out, a sound of agony and pure power as the energy surged through him. He felt his mind expand, connecting to something vast, something ancient, something that had been waiting. The dormant Guardian activated. The colossal figure on the throne stirred. Its intricate armor hummed with a deep, resonant power. The golden light in its visor intensified, burning with the light of 1,000 suns. Its massive gauntleted hands, which had been resting inertly, clenched into fists. A low, guttural groan, not of pain but of awakening, vibrated through the deck. The battle between the Space Marines and the Tyranid Hive Tyrant faltered. Both factions, sensing the immense, suddenly active power, paused, their attention snapping to the awakened Guardian. Their ancient, innate instincts screamed danger. The Guardian slowly rose from its throne, a titan of ancient power. Its golden eyes, now fully blazing, swept over the chaos, taking in the scene with an ancient, terrifying intelligence. It saw the alien invaders, the destruction, the two heroes, and the vastness of the void beyond. It raised one of its massive, gauntleted hands. The air crackled with raw psychic energy. Golden lightning arced around its fingers, illuminating the deck in a blinding display of power. Then, a wave of pure, concentrated psionic force erupted from its hand, slamming into the Space Marines and the Tyranid Hive Tyrant simultaneously. It wasn't an explosion of physical force, but a blow to the very fabric of their minds, their beings. The Space Marines staggered, their power armor glowing ominously as their internal systems struggled against the psychic assault. They roared in defiance, but their movements were slow, disoriented. The Tyranid Hive Tyrant shrieked, a sound of pure agony, its multifaceted eyes going dim as its connection to the hive mind was severed, its alien mind reeling from the impossible, focused attack. The smaller swarms, suddenly devoid of direction, chittered in confusion, attacking each other or simply freezing in place. Tony, protected by Peter's momentary connection, felt the ripple of power, but was otherwise unharmed. He looked at Peter, who had collapsed onto the throne, unconscious, but alive. The golden glow around the Guardian had subsided to a strong, steady pulse. "Friday, report," Tony yelled, his voice filled with awe. "Boss, the Guardian is fully active. It is purging. The psychic energy signature is overwhelming. It appears to be targeting and neutralizing all hostile alien life forms within the vessel. And it's drawing power from the ship itself, stabilizing the core reactor. It's buying us time." The Guardian continued its silent, terrifying work. Golden psychic energy flowed through the deck, into every crack, every crevice of the ship. The Space Marines convulsed, their armor systems failing, then collapsing, their life signs rapidly diminishing. The Hive Tyrant, unable to withstand the continuous targeted psychic assault, imploded, its massive biomass consumed by the very energy that had attacked it. The swarms disintegrated, reduced to dust. Within minutes, the observation deck was silent again, save for the hum of the Guardian and the distant, dying groans of the ship. All traces of the invading aliens were gone. Tony stumbled towards Peter, carefully checking the kid's vitals. His pulse was strong, but he was completely out. The sheer psychic feedback had overwhelmed him. He looked up at the Guardian, which stood silently, majestically, on the throne, its golden gaze fixed on the fractured windows, on the vast hostile void. "Friday, what now?" Did it just save us?" Tony asked, almost reverently. "Affirmative, boss. The Guardian is purging the ship of all hostile entities. However, its primary function appears to be to protect the vessel and its core systems. It is not designed for interdimensional travel or facilitating return journeys." "Great," Tony sighed, glancing at the immense throne. "So we just exchanged one problem for another. At least this one isn't actively trying to kill us." He ran a hand over his mangled armor. His power was completely drained now. He was truly helpless. "We need a way home, Friday, and fast. This ship is still falling apart." Suddenly, the Guardian lowered its gaze, its golden eyes fixing on Tony. It didn't move, but Tony felt a distinct presence in his mind. A gentle, probing touch that didn't speak in words, but in images and sensations. It showed him a vast network of interdimensional pathways, raw cosmic energy, and then a flickering image of Earth. It was an ancient, powerful entity, acknowledging his predicament. It was offering him a path, but the path was unstable, dangerous, barely a theoretical possibility. It required immense power, carefully channeled, precisely timed. The Guardian itself didn't have the strength to create such a rift, only to show him where one could be formed. It was a bridge, not a ferryman. Tony understood. The Guardian was telling him how to get home, but he had to build the road himself. He looked around the observation deck, now eerily quiet. The ship was still immense, but heavily damaged. The Guardian was stabilizing the core, but for how long? And where would he find enough power? And how would he channel it into an interdimensional portal? His eyes fell on the Guardian's throne. It was ancient, studded with strange energy-conducting gems. And the Guardian itself was a conduit of immense refined psionic energy. Friday, if we could somehow interface with the Guardian's power source, could we create a localized rift? A jump point back to our dimension? Tony asked, his mind racing, already sketching out schematics in his head. Theoretically, yes, boss. The Guardian's core could provide the necessary energy. However, interfacing with such an ancient alien system would be immensely difficult and dangerous. And Peter is currently incapacitated. Tony looked at Peter, then back at the Guardian. I don't have a choice. I'm Iron Man. I build things. And I'm getting us home. He carefully moved Peter from the throne, laying him gently on the deck. He then began to strip away damaged sections of his armor, revealing the intricate Stark tech beneath. He needed components. He needed tools. He needed a plan. He noticed the intricate wiring within the throne, the subtle energy conduits running through the dais. He began to work, his mind in overdrive, his fingers moving with practiced precision despite the pain. He salvaged what he could from his own suit, an arc reactor core, a few remaining energy relays, the suit's primary AI interface, and began to integrate it with the throne's ancient technology. The Guardian watched him, silent, unmoving, its golden eyes glowing. It allowed him to work, a silent benefactor. Hours blurred into a frantic, desperate blur of sparks, strained grunts, and the rhythmic hum of alien power. Tony worked tirelessly, drawing on every ounce of his genius, every scrap of his experience. He was building an interdimensional portal from scratch using alien tech and a dying power suit. It was the most challenging engineering feat of his life. He finally stood back, panting, covered in grease and sweat. Before him, integrated into the ancient throne, was a crude but functional Stark tech interface, glowing with a faint blue light. He had jury-rigged a system to tap into the Guardian's core, not to activate it, but to channel its dormant power into a localized, controlled interdimensional rift. Friday. Status report on the device, Tony said, his voice raw. System online, boss. Power conduits are stable. Energy flow from the Guardian's core is sufficient. Calculating optimal temporal and spatial coordinates for return to Earth dimension. Rift probability, 67%. 67% isn't great, but it's a lot better than zero, Tony muttered, then looked at Peter. He gently lifted the unconscious teen, cradling him. All right, kid, time to go home. He carried Peter to the center of the platform he had built, laying him carefully on the makeshift energy pad. He then moved to the control panel, a hodgepodge of Stark tech and alien circuitry. He placed his hand on the primary activator, the arc reactor core from his suit, repurposed. The Guardian, sensing his intent, emitted a low, resonant hum. Its golden eyes intensified, sending a surge of raw, refined psychic energy into Tony's makeshift device. The platform beneath Peter began to glow a vibrant, swirling blue. A vortex of energy began to form in the center of the observation deck, coalescing from the very fabric of space. It pulsed, shimmered, and expanded, revealing a glimpse of swirling colors, of other realities, of home. Tony watched, awestruck, as the rift stabilized. He had done it. He had built a bridge back to Earth. All right, Friday, prepare for extraction. Peter first, Tony commanded, his voice filled with a desperate hope. Affirmative, boss. Initiating matter transfer for Spider-Man. The blue light around Peter intensified. He began to shimmer, his form becoming translucent. In a flash of light, he vanished, pulled into the swirling vortex, safely transported back to their home dimension. Tony let out a shaky breath of relief. One down, now for him. He stepped onto the platform, feeling the strange pull of the rift. He glanced back at the ancient guardian, who stood sentinel on its throne, its golden eyes still fixed on him. It had shown him the way. It had allowed him to harness its power. It was a silent, ancient ally. "Thanks," Tony whispered. A genuine, heartfelt thanks to the inanimate yet sentient being. "Boss, the rift is destabilizing. The ship's structural integrity is failing again. You have approximately 10 seconds before the connection is severed." Friday's voice crackled with renewed urgency. Tony's heart hammered. He had waited too long. The ship was truly dying now. He didn't hesitate. He slammed his hand onto the control panel, initiating the transfer. The blue light enveloped him. The strange, disorienting sensation of transdimensional travel washing over him. He felt the rift collapsing around him, a violent, crushing force. He heard the shriek of tearing metal, the roar of the ship finally giving up its ancient ghost. He was being pulled apart, stretched across realities, barely holding on. Then darkness, cold, absolute darkness. Tony Stark awoke to the blindingly familiar lights of his own lab. The scent of ozone and freshly brewed coffee, a stark contrast to the metallic ash and alien stench of the derelict ship, filled his nostrils. He was lying on a medical bed, hooked up to an array of diagnostics. His body ached, but it was a familiar ache, a human ache. He was home. "Boss, welcome back." Friday's voice, clear and concise, filled the lab. "External scans indicate minimal temporal displacement. You and Peter Parker have been returned to our dimension, approximately 3 minutes after your departure." Tony pushed himself up, blinking against the bright lights. He was wearing a medical gown, his Mark 85 armor lying in pieces on a workbench, utterly destroyed. He glanced around. "His lab pristine, organized, safe? Peter? Where's the kid?" Tony asked, his voice hoarse. "Mr. Parker is in the adjacent medical bay, boss. He sustained minor cerebral overloads from the psychic exposure, but is otherwise stable and recovering. Dr. Cho expects a full recovery within hours." Relief, pure and unadulterated, washed over Tony. Peter was safe. They were both safe. He swung his legs off the bed, feeling the solid floor beneath his feet. He walked over to the workbench, running a hand over the shattered remains of his armor. "She really held on until the end, didn't she, Friday? Mark 85 performed admirably under extreme duress, boss. Its core programming prioritizes your survival above all else. It bought you the time needed for your unorthodox engineering project." Tony chuckled, a dry, weary sound. Unorthodox is one word for it. Insane is another. He picked up a Picel XXXV of the helmet, looking at the cracked visor. He remembered the ancient guardian, silent, majestic, watching him work. The space marines, the Tyranids, the collapsing ship. It all felt like a fever dream. He walked into the adjacent medical bay. Peter was lying in a similar bed, eyes closed, a peaceful expression on his face, a faint blue light indicating active neurological recovery. Tony pulled up a chair and sat beside him, watching the kid breathe. "You did good, kid," Tony murmured, a soft smile on his face. "You did real good." He thought of the cosmic horror they had faced, the sheer scale of the conflict in that forgotten corner of the universe, the vastness of it all, and how small, how insignificant, two heroes from Earth seemed against such forces. But they had faced it, they had survived, and they had even found a silent ally in the dying heart of that brutal, ancient ship. Tony knew this was just a glimpse, a single horrifying chapter in a universe far larger and more terrifying than he had ever imagined. The multiverse was real, and it was filled with monsters and wonders beyond comprehension. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that this wouldn't be the last time they faced such impossible threats. But for now, they were home. They had each other, and they had learned something invaluable. No matter how desperate the situation, no matter how overwhelming the odds, ingenuity, courage, and a little bit of Stark-level madness could always find a way. Tony reached out, gently ruffling Peter's hair. "Get some rest, kid. We've got a lot to talk about when you wake up, and I think we're going to need a bigger armor budget." He stood up, walking back into his lab. The world was still out there, chaotic and dangerous, but he was ready. He looked at the shattered Mark 85. It was time for an upgrade. For both of them, the universe had just gotten a whole lot bigger, and Iron Man and Spider-Man were ready for it. The adventure, he realized, had only just begun.